Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson, Section 19, start of Subsection 1. The house was crammed as they came into their box at 20 minutes past 8. "This is what Jim calls sawdust," said Neville. "We shall have 10 minutes of it after all." "Sawdust?" "Yes, don't you know the smell of it in a circus? It's a kind of symbol for anticipation. Jim always insists on getting to entertainments about 10 minutes before they begin. He likes to sit and smell and watch horses' feet under the flap. I entirely sympathize." Enid nodded emphatically. "I quite see," she said. "But it's rather subtle." "Not in the least too subtle for Jim. My word, what a packed house!" As he leaned forward and surveyed it from the seat furthest from the stage, with Enid next to him, then Algie, and then Mrs. Bessington. Mrs. Bessington always desired to be as close as possible on every occasion. He began to perceive that there was another kind of sawdust, too, that he was enjoying. It was inexpressibly delightful to be here with Enid, actually sitting next to her, drawing her cloak off her shoulders over the back of the chair, making small remarks when he wished to. He would have about 3 more months' sawdust, and then the curtain would go up. And they would both be on stage as well as in front. It would be a dream come true for once. He could hear Mrs. Bessington's voice rumbling away to Algie. "Why, there are the Heckers," said the girl suddenly. Neville followed her eyes, and there indeed they were, in the stalls below, both with that extremely finished and adequate appearance which Americans in London always have. Mrs. Hecker's costume caught the eye at once. It was largely orange in color, what there was of it. Mr. Hecker looked as if he had been born in his clothes, and had had them ironed on him every morning and evening ever since, with a continuous replacing of their wasted tissue. Mrs. Hecker was inspecting people slowly through a lorgnette. Mr. Hecker held the opera glasses ready for her when the curtain should go up. Enid's face suddenly dimpled with laughter. "I wonder what Selva would have to say to her," she said. "What will the message be to her, right here and now?" "It's a responsibility for Selva," said Neville. "If she only knew. She's an Australian, isn't she?" "She'll be equal to it," said the girl. "Yes, I believe she is." "You met her in Rome, didn't you? I mean Selva." "Yes, at the Heckers. Don't you remember? You couldn't come?" "She's perfectly extraordinary, isn't she?" Enid hesitated. "I know you'll hate what I'm going to say." "Go on." "Well, men always think so. Of course I see her power, but I don't think it's a very high sort. Well, you'll see. Certainly she holds the house." "She's got her house anyhow, that's one thing. What does she like to talk to?" "I hardly spoke to her," said the girl indifferently. Then the orchestra began, and Neville took up his program. The program was of that kind that Selva had made famous. First, it cost a shilling, and there were no advertisements at all, beyond the announcement of the plays in which Selva would appear, with their dates. Most of them were of the usual kind, La Dama Camelia, La Tosca, and so forth. But tonight she was playing Margaret, a comedy for men, written, it seemed, especially for her, by an Australian dramatist. The program proceeded to give an interpretation of the play, of the kind generally associated with concerts and the performance of Beethoven's sonatas. It was indescribably solemn and reverent, like the handling of a fragile piece of china by a connoisseur. It gave the most precise account not so much of the play itself as of its symbolism, and informed the audience carefully of the emotions which were proper for them to feel at each point. Margaret herself, it seemed, stood for womanhood, and womanhood for a tragedy that to the rest of the world was a comedy. The writer of the program, probably James Daniels himself, the author of the play, was just tactful enough. He argued that there were no doubt various opinions, quod hominis tot sententiae, but that on the whole it must be confessed that woman, even now, had not risen to her proper place in the world. That she tended to become either the toy or the drudge of man. At this point he quoted some lines from Locksley Hall and some more from The Princess. This play, then, was intended to set out the tragedy of womanhood, but the audience were entreated, ironically, to remember that it was only a comedy for men. In the first act they would be invited to witness a perfect domestic circle, the man, the woman, and the child, sanctified by holy matrimony. Here the writer permitted himself a sneer or two at the Christian religion. In the second act they would see the old foundations of human instinct emerging, the man beginning to assert himself, as he always did, and the woman struggling to keep pace with his impossible demands. For Margaret was the social inferior of the man. He had married her. telling her that she would take his place in society, cheating both himself and her. In the second act, therefore, this begins to come out. Margaret, who loves like a woman, idealistically, spiritually, exquisitely, finds that the man's love is not like hers. She has begun to lose her freshness, while the man is merely maturing. She makes one or two little social mistakes. Well, there is an explanation and a reconciliation. In the third act, the exquisite point of the comedy begins, for after another gaucherie on Margaret's part, an impulsive act founded on generosity of character, the man begins to find sport in watching her make an exhibition of herself. He leads her on to commit social blunders, out of a devilish kind of cruelty. He laughs over her with his friends. She knows nothing of this. A friend of her husband's makes mock love to her, with the husband's approving delight. She takes him seriously and begins to love him in return. Then the catastrophe. She confesses to her husband, and is met by his brutal indifference. It does not matter to him what she does. She has already ruined him and dragged him down in the world. The scales fall from her eyes, and she perishes by her own hand. Such is the outline of this story. To call the program priggish and pedagogic would be to pay it a considerable compliment. Neville wrinkled his nose as he finished it. "This man's a bounder," he said under his breath, as the curtains brightened suddenly and the talking stopped. Subsection 2. At the end of the first act, Neville leaned back with a sigh of pleasure and turned to Enid. Talking had burst out in an excited roar suddenly and loudly all over the house, mingled with ecstatic clapping. He turned back again to the curtain as Selva emerged all alone to take the applause, and began to clap, himself smiling. Selva was a tall and very nearly gaunt-looking woman, made up to the eyes. In herself she was nothing. She had qualities of brown hair, probably a wig. There was nothing remarkable about her figure. Her face, seen now against the brutally bright drop curtain, with the footlights immediately beneath her, was sharp and imperious, and evidently middle-aged. But in the piece she had been exquisite. She had not merely resembled, she had simply incarnated a young wife, very simple, adorably natural, passionately proud of her husband and child. Nothing particular had happened. Persons had been introduced who, to those who had read the program, were significant of what was to follow. The general lines had been sketched, but the overwhelming charm was in the picture of a perfect domestic happiness. Selva's little cry of delight as her husband comes in from hunting, the way her eyes follow him, his obvious love of her, with scarcely a touch of patronage. It was these things that a tremendous genius had transfigured. There was probably not a romantic girl in the theater who had not seen the enacting of her own hopes. There was not a married man who did not feel tenderer towards his wife. The thing had been as light and delicate as a summer morning. The husband had been quite adequate, but it was Selva who had been the very heart of all the emotion. She was recalled twice, and Neville marveled. "My dear," he said, "I don't know what you mean. Surely that was simply perfect." Enid smiled a little. "Oh, I don't deny her power," she said. "Did you see?" "What?" "Nothing." Neville began to examine the people again. He felt wonderfully elated, for he was conscious, as everyone is conscious when he is entirely satisfied with a new experience, that was exactly what he had known all along. He had not put it like that before, certainly, but it was what he had always meant. Hartley, to come down to concrete facts, Hartley would be just like, in a year or two, a scene of perfect comradeship and passion and peace. He wondered what it was that Enid meant in saying that although Selva had power, it did not seem to her that it was of a very high order. "I say, old man, beg pardon, Miss Bessington, I say, what about a cigarette?" Neville looked around. He did not in the least want a cigarette, but really Algy deserved it. He glanced at Enid. "Yes, do," she said. "And you might see what Mr. Hecker wants if you can find him. He's been trying to attract your attention." "She's great," began Algy, when they got outside. "She's magnificent." "I meant Mrs. Bessington," explained Algy. "I've had her entire married life laid before me, and she wants to know why I'm not married myself. I couldn't hear a word they were saying on the stage, but I suppose it's all right." It was not so easy to find Mr. Hecker. The passages were thronged with men, and the clink of glasses grew louder as they advanced. A positive roar of voices greeted them as they pushed open the door of the restaurant. Neville looked round, and then Mr. Hecker was on him. "Great, isn't she?" he said. "Pleased to see you, Sir Neville. And you, sir." Neville introduced Mr. Lennox. "My wife wants to know if you can come and meet her at the Cecil. She's coming to us on Saturday afternoon. No matinees on Saturday, you know. Much too select. Tuesdays and Thursdays are her days. Try one of these cigarettes. They're straight from Samus." He was just the same, alert, trim, self-effacing, and intelligent. He belonged to Mrs. Hecker, wholly, just as if he were her electric brougham. Neville could not conceive of him as possessing an independent existence. "I shall be delighted," said Neville. "And bring your friends along if they'd care to come. I'll send them a card. Care to come, Mr. Lennox?" Mr. Lennox said he would care to come very much indeed. Had Mr. Hecker known Madame Selva long, and would he have a drink? "No thanks, sir, no drink. Mrs. Hecker, she doesn't like that. Between meals, and, upon my word, she's right. Yes, we've known Madame Selva since last fall. Ran across her in New York. She's great." When they got back to the box, Enid was leaning back silent, and Mrs. Bessington was reading her program. But the latter laid it down resolutely at the sight of Mr. Lennox. "They want us to go meet Madame Selva on Monday. He said they'd send a card around. I gave them your address." Enid looked at him, nodded, and said nothing. Then again the curtain brightened, and the talking sank to a great silence. When the second act ended, Neville's eyes were full of tears. He did not consider himself emotional, but it had been simply poignant. The act had ended, as had been said, with a reconciliation, but it was a reconciliation that could not last. The characters of husband and wife were essentially diverse, not complementary, but antagonistic. The end was inevitable. "I suppose there's no hope at all," he said, smiling. "I mean, I should be better pleased if the play was unconvincing. If I could feel it didn't really happen so, but that the author made it up." Enid looked at him. "I can't feel it like that," she said. "I seem to see through her all the time. It isn't Margaret at all to me. It's Selva. And I don't like Selva." "Oh, dear me," said Neville. Enid laid a hand on the edge of the box. "She's made up quite intolerably," she said. "But, my dear girl, what else could she do? She must be 45. "Then she shouldn't play a girl of 22. Then Algy, with the expression of a drowning man, caught his eye again. Subsection 3. As Neville, after the final fall of the curtain, followed the ladies down the thick carpeted corridor, he was moved down to the very bottom of his soul. The tragedy had come swift and inevitable as a hammer falling rapidly. The third act had begun quietly, as a lull before the storm breaks. It had opened with a little dinner party that went well. Margaret, obviously a little anxious, had managed matters satisfactorily, but it was her very anxiety that had provoked her husband's wrath, and this wrath had been precipitated by a little tale told to him by his friend over the wine. Then it was that he had resolved at least to get his sport out of her, and the fiendish little plot had been arranged for her humiliation. In the second scene of the act, the man had begun to make mock love, very deftly and persuasively, and Margaret, smarting from her husband's attitude, had been tempted to yield to him. Then in the third scene came the catastrophe. She had told her husband with a horrible simplicity of all that happened, overwhelmed with contrition, yet with a piteous kind of hope that even this confession would mend matters. And he had burst into dreadful laughter, telling her to her face, first, that anything she chose to do would be indifferent to him, that she had already spoiled his life by her ill-breeding and her empty indiscretions, and finally, in a burst of contempt, that he had known all the while of what was happening, that his friend cared nothing for her, and that the thing was a mere comedy. It was then that the climax of Selva's acting had come. Up to that point she had been the simple girl, striving to become, for her husband's sake, a woman of the world. Then, in silence, with the stage empty of all figures except hers, the audience had seen that development of character, which should have taken 5 years, compressed into 10 minutes. She had grown into a woman, fierce and disillusioned. She had seen her spoilt life in a vista, and that it was incapable of mending. Then, yet more swiftly, the primitive passions had surged up, and she had seen that life was such a man, that life, even without him now, was intolerable. The child had come in to prolong the agony, and the cord had hung suspended. Without the program, it might well have been thought, at any rate, at first, that the child's influence might prevail. Then, with a real horror, the audience had perceived that one pose was surcharged on another. That Margaret, deadly quiet and controlled, was soothing the child, merely that he might not be terrified. That her mind was made up, and that her intention would be carried out. And the child too suspects there is something wrong, and once more, with an appalling self-control, his mother reassures him. The child is at last taken back to bed. Then, with a swiftness at which the audience held its breath, she gets out her husband's revolver, and, without hesitation or faltering, shoots herself through the head. As acted by Selva, the story was overwhelmingly convincing. So ended the comedy. It is astonishing how an emotional stimulus, if only deep enough, stirs up 100 dormant thoughts which, critically considered, have no kind of connection with the thought which arouses them. So it was with Neville. Objectively taken, there was nothing whatever in common between the play he had just witnessed and his own life, except indeed that the play turned on the relations between husband and wife. Not one of the elements or circumstances which had developed the situations on the stage was present, so far as he knew, in his own relations with Enid. Yet for all of that, his emotions and passions were all astir, as birds when a gun is fired. Vague ideas of sacrifice and love, and the possibilities of tragedy, if the conditions of these were not observed, circled around his soul. Mrs. Bessington, he understood, was talking to him over her shoulder. He assented smilingly, but he could not catch more than one sentence in three. He felt he must talk very hard to Enid indeed. He felt that there was a large number of things that must be discussed, but he could not probably, if questioned, have given any coherent answer as to what these were. There was the usual uncomfortable pause before they could get their motors. He was to go home in his own, dropping Elgie on the way, and the Bessingtons were to go back in theirs. Elgie volunteered to go and look for them, and Mrs. Bessington, of course, with a vague desire to be helpful, followed him out a few steps under the glass porch, and stood looking about, in the very middle of the steps, hindering everyone. Neville drew Enid aside, behind the fastened-back glass doors. They had that little space to themselves. "It's astounding," he said. "By the way, will you be able to come and meet her?" Enid glanced at him. "You want to, so much," she said. "Why, of course I do," said Neville. "I want to take her to bits and see how it's done. I want to see how she holds her teacup, and whether she crosses her feet when she sits down, and the whole thing. She was 3 separate and distinct people this evening, and yet they were all Margaret. My dear, you must see what a wonder she is." "I see her power perfectly," said Enid in a rather high voice, "but I don't think she's Margaret. By the way, it's an impossible play." "I should have said so if I hadn't seen Selva act it," said Neville. She let her eyes rest on him a moment, as if appraising him. It was as she had looked at Fraschetti once or twice. "Yes?" said Neville. She laughed softly. "Are all men like you?" she asked. "Do none of you see through that kind of thing?" Neville really was a little pricked. "My dear girl, if you don't see that she's a genius, I despair. Oh, don't be tiresome, please. I assure you she's great." For an instant he thought she was annoyed. Her eyelids came down a little and her mouth grew grave. Then again she laughed, naturally and easily. "Well, most people seem to agree with you, certainly," she said. Then Mrs. Bessington was seen through the glass door, with her lips still moving, to be turning her eyes this way and that. Neville looked out to the front, and there was Elgie at the door of the Bessingtons' motor.